I wrote an article a few years ago about this question of building pipelines in Canada, which, as you can imagine, is hugely controversial, which deals not just with environmental matters, but also very complex land claims matters, First Nations land claims matters. So I guess it's a spatial planning issue. It just happens to be a very hot issue in Canada. And the point I was making is an analogy. And I found a photograph. I don't have it on the screen, but it was a photograph of a pipeline that went like this across the land. In other words, it's not a straight line. And I think that's a useful analogy for this work, that there's almost never an easy straight line. You're always dealing with specific issues and specific legacies or features of the physical terrain or the social terrain, and you're finding a way to move forward. Sorry, I realize I should be deferring to you. You know much more about spatial issues, but I'm using this just as an analogy. You may want to add something from your perspective. But as an analogy, you can almost never make a straight line. So the question in all of this is about how do you deal with the reality of the situation with all its physical and emotional and social and economic irregularities, if I can put it that way. And I think we get stuck if we imagine that we can figure this out before we start. In practice, it's about feeling your way forward. I quoted in my book, in this book, a sentence which is very well known in Chinese. Deng Xiaoping was giving a speech about he was giving a speech about Chinese economic policy, and the phrase used at the time was socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I'm not an expert on China, but I've always thought about this is a place where you can just make straight lines because you have such authority. But the phrase he used, which is very well known in Chinese, is, "We're crossing the river feeling for stones." And I love this image that we're crossing the river feeling for stones. We don't know what the next step is. So I'm making this pipeline analogy and this crossing the river analogy because a lot of these points need that orientation. So yes, often there are issues of trauma or mistrust or fear or emotions. So yes, it's an illusion to imagine that this only requires a rational attending to rational matters. And so you do what is needed in the circumstances, and often what's needed is for various things to happen, whether it's about people expressing themselves or asserting their position or connecting to one another or expressing their trauma. Various things, maybe many things, have to happen before we are ready to, quote, solve the problem rationally. One of you referred to the problem of labeling. And of course, often when a group meets starts to work together, they have strong opinions about each other. That's perfectly ordinary. And it's always interesting. One of the activities we often do in our workshops, which is very popular, is the simplest possible exercise. It's the following. Look around the room, find the person most different from you, who you thought you would never encounter, and go for a walk with them. You couldn't imagine anything simpler. Or if for some reason it doesn't work for you to walk because of the climate or your ability, then talk facing in the same direction, not face to face. And it's always interested me that this is the most popular thing we do ever. People say, we don't really need so many plenary sessions, but could we have another walk? That was really useful. So I thought a lot about that walk. And I think there's two explanations. One of them is a mechanical explanation. When you're walking, you're facing in the same direction, you're moving through territory, you're dealing with the turns in the road or the log across the road. You're not on your phone, you're not looking at the paper. So there's certain reasons why the walk is interesting. But I spoke a few years ago to a Mexican colleague, and she said, Adam, all of that is true, but that's not the real reason the walk is so good. This is a Mexican theologian. And she said, the reason the walk is so powerful, and she spoke as somebody who had been in this workshop and experienced it, is that when I go for a walk with somebody, the sequence is crucial. First, I am encountering them as a fellow human being. And then, second, maybe I will decide to change what I think or what I do. She said that's the opposite of the traditional Catholic confessional, where first you admit you were wrong, and then you're readmitted to the communion. So this idea that the first thing is the human connection. And often people go for walks, and it's very dramatic because we all know, oh, those two went, I wonder what happened to them. And they come back and they haven't agreed on anything, especially, but they a little bit see each other beyond the labels as fellow human beings. And so I'm just making the point that the idea that we just have to immediately start solving the problem rationally, I think is a very incomplete understanding of these human dynamics. I don't have any particular experience with stakeholders who are not physically present, but I think it's interesting. There are methods, I think, sorry, the name of the person escapes me, but there are methods to include nature or future generations or people who can't be present for any reason. I think this whole idea of let's try to understand the situation from multiple perspectives, including the perspectives of which cannot be directly spoken by somebody in the room. This is all very helpful. And the general sequence is, first let's try to get not agreement on the current reality, but at least hear different perspectives on the current reality. Let's be willing to stay in that longer than is comfortable, and then move to what can we do about it. We have a colleague named Jeff Barnum, who's an artist. Some of you may have seen my book, Power and Love, and the illustrations in that book are by Jeff Barnum. And he's a great artist, but he's also studied a lot of art theory. And in art theory, there is a notion which is attributed to the poet Keats. It's a well-known phrase. It's called negative capability. Some of you may have heard of it. Anyhow, it's a well-known phrase in art theory. But what Keats meant is the ability to stay in uncertainty and doubt for a long time. And that's crucial. So I'm saying all of these, everything I'm saying is in contrast to let's agree on A, and then when we've agreed on A, we'll agree on B, and then we'll go to C. It doesn't have to be that linear or close one at a time. In practice, it's more like we're in a mess, and then we stay in it for longer than is comfortable, and then it becomes clear at least what the next thing we're willing to do is. And one of you said after the first round that you found consensus to be a impoverished objective, that it was often watered down. And I do think that that's true. And that's why I often tell this story about President Santos, where saying that it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. So this idea that we all have to agree on everything before we can do anything is completely incorrect, but many people believe that. And often what happens is We've worked together, we agree on some things, we don't agree on other things, and some of us are going to go off and do this, and others of us are going to go off and do that, and I'm not going to do anything, I'm going to wait. And it's not about maybe we'll sign a pact, but maybe we won't. Maybe we'll all just continue to act in our own spheres of influence, but somewhat better informed, with somewhat greater capacity, and, very importantly, with somewhat stronger relationships. It interested me in this Mexico project, which was very difficult for all kinds of reasons, to work on insecurity, illegality, and inequity, that one of the company CEOs and one of the community leaders spoke on the phone once a week after that. It wasn't that they were allies, but there were a lot of things they needed to talk about. And it wasn't, I only found this out by accident, it wasn't a group agreement. It's just they got along pretty well and they helped each other. Sorry, another Mexico story which I think is interesting. We work with two groups in Mexico. And sorry, I'm going to get the date mixed up, but I think in 2017 there was an earthquake in Mexico, around Mexico City. I might have the year wrong. One of the groups had been working together for 2 months, and another group had been working together for 2 years. We had WhatsApp groups for both of these teams. And so the same event happened on the same date, the earthquake, and I was watching on my phone these two conversations. The people who've been working together for 2 months, it was all about who's to blame, who was a corrupt politician. The people who've been working together for 2 years, completely different conversation. It's, I've got some roofing materials. Does somebody know who I can talk to in Puebla? They don't agree. The interesting thing about the Mexicans, they actually don't agree any more than they did, but they're able to work together. So I'm sorry, I know I'm repeating myself, but this for me is the fluidity of radical collaboration. It's not about we agree and then we act. It's we connect, we have a little bit more understanding, a little bit more trust, a little bit more relationship, and then we do stuff to advance things. Okay, let me just see if there's anything else. On this question of removing obstacles, the expression, yes, I also found it a hugely evocative phrase, and I wrote a book inspired by that sentence. It's called Facilitating Breakthrough, and I'll send you the summary of that book. Sorry, just 2 more points and then I'll stop. Yes, I think this point about the kind of leadership required is different. This is something I learned early on. It's a leader not who will take a stand for a particular solution, but a leader, or more likely a collective of leaders, who will take a stand for a certain kind of process. That's a different kind of leadership, and it can be held collectively. There's usually in these complex conflictual contexts, no one person who can do it, but a group of people with different credibilities and backgrounds and connections are able to do it. Okay, now here's the final point I want to make, which I feel strongly about. I've tried often to calculate when something can begin. And I've concluded that you can't make a calculation of it. You have to, what's needed instead is, do I think something would be useful, and am I willing to try with others to initiate, to convene, to lead it? But this idea that until conditions A, B, C, D, and E are fulfilled, nothing can happen. I think this isn't how things work. Everything works, in this sense, the word social entrepreneur. I'm not generally that keen on the term social entrepreneur, but if an entrepreneur is somebody who sees an opportunity and is willing to step forward and take a risk because they think that something can be accomplished, then what's needed is that kind of entrepreneurial energy. And so maybe what's needed above all is, can you see that there's a potential here, and are you willing to do something to try to realize that potential? It may work, it may not work. You may start this, then the pipeline has to go like that, and then that, and then that, and 3 months in, it's completely different from what you thought. But there's no replacement for that entrepreneurial attitude. Last anecdote. I did some work a long time ago in Israel with a very diverse group of Jewish Israelis who, as you might know, have certain disagreements amongst them, right, left, religious, secular. And one of the workshops was next to in a hotel next to the Red Sea. So out the window you could see the Red Sea. And I was standing by the window next to an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who was a member of the group. And my middle name is Moses. My Hebrew middle name is Moses. And I said, do you know anything about Moses? This is a guy, 80 years old, ultra-Orthodox rabbi. I said, yeah, I know quite a bit about Moses. He said, you know the real story of the parting of the Red Sea, not the story that's in the Bible, but the story behind the story. I said, no, I never heard this. He said, well, the real story of what happened is that the Israelites arrived at the sea, it was not parted, and so they sat down beside and cried for somebody to do something. Moses, God, the prime minister, whatever, the director general. And a young man, I've always thought it was interesting, the story is a young man who could not swim, whose name was Nachshon. Nachshon stepped into the sea, and it was the act of stepping into the sea that split the sea. So I've always liked this image, not waiting on the bank for somebody to make a path, but it's the act of moving forward which creates the path. So good luck.